All right, guys. So today we're going to continue our discussion from Sapolsky's chapter about zebras to talk about stress. Today's going to be a little bit of a lengthier lecture, so buckle up. Just to recap what we talked about last time, the concept of stress was discovered by Hans Selye in the 1930s. Specifically, his cumulative studies of rats with the ovarian extract yielded that the body responds very similarly to many different stressors, and that stressors can also make you sick. Stressors are defined as events or situations that triggering a coping adjustment, and the coping adjustment is, of course, going to be kind of the coping response to stress. Stressors also disrupt allostasis, or potentially allostasis can also be disrupted by any anticipation of such disruption in the future. Generally speaking, we have acute physical, chronic physical, and psychosocial stressors. It is also important to note that some stress is good in nature, is short-lived, and makes life exciting, like being in a relationship or exercising. These are all things that are healthy kind of forms of stress, so not all stress is bad. And what makes these things healthier are that they are controlled, a person is willingly participating in these stressors, they're short-lived, there's meaning associated with the stress, and so the activation of the stress response in these situations, like being in a relationship or exercising, is kind of like, setting up that simple line of dominoes. It's easy to set up, it's easy to turn off, it's not chronic in nature, and so at the end of the day, we don't really see this kind of chronically damaging type of impact on the body, or the stress response being turned on in a way where it's difficult to turn back off. So the first thing that we're going to be focusing on today is breaking down the psychosocial stressor category into different subcategories, given that psychosocial stressors are, the type of stressor that impacts humans the most. So first off, we have significant life events, which would include things like leaving home, changing jobs, having a child, etc., etc. Kind of like, if you were telling the story of your life, these would probably be a lot of the high points. Catastrophes would be disasters impacting a large number of people, like environmental disasters or terrorism events, things like that. Daily hassles are going to be the everyday annoyances that happen all the time, like getting stuck in traffic. These are going to be the most significant source of stress for people. We also have environmental factors, which are aspects of our frequently daily surroundings, things like crowding, noise, pollution. And then we also have work-related stressors as well. And this would be just anything kind of relating to your job. So we're going to go through each of these one by one and just kind of, pick the category apart a bit more. So significant life events. Typically, the way that we determine the relative significance of a life event is to focus in on the amount of change that event causes to a person's life. So the more significant events would be things like death, divorce, separation, jail, personal illness or injury, things that are causing a lot of change. These two guys, Holmes and Rahe, actually took various life events and assigned them numbers, which are called life change units. And so these life change units were thought to represent the amount of change in one's life that a particular event was causing. Positive and negative events were included on their list, so you guys can see that I've highlighted some of the more positive events, or events that could at least be perceived positively by some folks, just to kind of highlight the number of things that happen to us positively that do cause change. And so change, again, isn't necessarily a negative thing. As I mentioned before, positive things can cause change as well, in addition to obviously more negative things. And so the idea that they had with these life change units is that in working with patients, you could ask them about their lives and you could tally up the number of LCUs that they built up over the course of a year in order to predict the likelihood of them coming sick. So some things to kind of keep in mind are that, it's nice that they were more kind of open, I guess, to including positive things, but having a high number of LCUs because you got married and became pregnant and got a new job, or started school or got healthier. This is different than someone who has maybe lost several loved ones or lost their job or gotten divorced. And so it does make a difference whether we're dealing with more positive or negative events. Holmes and Rahe also didn't really take into consideration whether or not various events were resolved. Like, it's one thing if you got divorced in the last year and you guys are still fighting it out in the lawyer's offices versus if you had an amicable divorce and it's already been settled. And so when asking patients about life events to try and figure out where they are and their risk of getting sick, some things to remember are it is important to take note of the positives and the negatives, because even the positive things like getting married or becoming pregnant are still stressful. And so it's important to kind of make sure that we're asking about those things. But again, kind of keeping in mind what each event means for the person. So not just assuming that marriage is a good thing, because it might not always be a good thing for everybody. Not just assuming that divorce is a bad thing, not just assuming that pregnancy is a good thing, or not just assuming that, you know, a son or a daughter leaving home is a bad thing. So asking people about various events and then asking them what these events mean to them. And we want to do this using an open-ended value neutral question. So how is that going versus imposing our own value on the situation by asking like, oh my gosh, are you loving it so much, when asking, you know, a woman about her pregnancy, because she might not be loving it so much. So we want to ask open-ended value neutral questions to let the patient kind of tell us legitimately how they're feeling versus, again, kind of putting our values onto them. We also want to ask about event resolution and coping. So like, how have you been coping with that? You know, has the divorce or the separation resolved itself, or is that something that you're still going through? Because it does make a difference as to whether or not a stressor is ongoing or we're in more of the coping kind of resolution stage. It's also important to consider cultural differences with respect to various holidays that a person might have gone through, or the meaning of, you know, what it means to be an empty nester. So for someone whose life has really been about raising children, whether that's a personal decision or more kind of how your role is conceptualized within your culture, you want to acknowledge that and not just assume that, you know, a child leaving home is a good thing because, you know, now you might have more room. So just kind of consider all of those things, basically. Consider that different stressors can mean different things for different people. Ask them in a neutral way about what's going on, and then ask about whether or not the event's been resolved or not. And then that can be a way to kind of predict where a person's at and their likelihood of getting sick. Another psychosocial stressor is a catastrophe. So again, these would be large level stressors that impact a huge number of people at once. The first big catastrophe that was really studied was 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear meltdown that happened in Pennsylvania in the late 70s. Some things that we kind of learned about the population of people around that time is that people who were impacted by the meltdown had chronically high stress for more than a year later. And a lot of this went back to fears of radiation and how this was going to impact them. We didn't really have as clear data as we do now about the impact of radiation. So this was a really scary situation for those people. They didn't really know what was going to happen. Like, if I'm fine 2 years later, does that mean that I'm fine, or am I still going to get sick later? We also observed higher blood pressure and elevated adrenal hormones among this group, so indicators of stress-induced illness. Some additional findings that we've taken away from other types of catastrophes are that proximity matters. One such example comes to us from 9/11. So you guys can see on the screen a map of Manhattan. Research indicated that people who were in the orange space south of Canal Street when the planes hit and the towers came down, that there was about 20% likelihood of developing PTSD, versus people who were physically just a little bit further up in the yellow space between 110th and Canal. There was only a 7% likelihood of developing PTSD. So proximity matters. So that can be important to keep in mind if you do end up working kind of as a mental health first responder or just a first responder in general. You know, if we're dealing with like a hurricane, for instance, it makes sense, you know, where ground zero is and where people were, because just being a few blocks back can decrease the likelihood of mental health ramifications. Another kind of interesting thing to keep in mind is that electronic exposure to mass events is now something that happens as well. So it's not just about being in Manhattan on 9/11, but it's sitting there and just kind of marinating in all this terrible stuff, watching the news. And the news is on 24/7 now, in the form of news you can watch versus stories you can read. The pictures and videos that we have access to with the internet too are completely different than what we had access to even a couple decades ago. And so now it's possible to develop PTSD level reactions and a stress response without even having been involved in a catastrophe in the first place. So a child could develop a fear of school because of a shooting that happened on the other side of the country. Daily hassles, as I mentioned earlier, is the most significant source of stress. So this includes things like missing your alarm, getting stuck in traffic, living with an aggravating roommate, things like that. Health impact depends on a couple of things. The frequency. So how often is this happening? Is this happening once a day, once a week, multiple times a day? How intense is it? Is this something that's mildly annoying, or is this like really getting you aggravated? And the duration, is this 5 minutes of traffic, or are we talking about like Washington, D.C., like 2 hours worth of traffic? And all of that collectively is going to impact health. So obviously more frequent, more intense, longer stressors are going to be more impactful on health. People's reactions to minor hassles can be influenced by their personality, their coping style, and how that hassle relates to the rest of their day. So these can be areas of intervention. Providing a person with a greater ability to cope can be a way to address a hassle. If a person has a more neurotic, kind of irritable personality, that could be an avenue for therapeutic intervention as well. Another way to intervene is to direct a patient's focus to the counterpart to the daily hassle, which is the daily uplift. So these would be mood lifting experiences that similarly happen on a daily basis. But a lot of people have a greater tendency to focus on the negative than the positive. So it can be helpful even as, like a nurse, someone who is not really doing a lot of mental health intervention and might only have a little bit of time with a patient, if they're talking about like getting stuck in traffic and the daily grind, like you can just take a minute and say like, oh, well, like tell me 3 things that you're grateful for. That's a really easy intervention that takes 5 seconds, and just kind of directing their focus to the positive, things they're grateful for, things that happened that were pleasant that day can really help to shift a person's focus and feel less kind of defeated by the hassles. So daily uplifts may help to buffer against hassles, basically. Lazarus did some research in the 80s. These were the top hassles and uplifts that were identified. And granted, this research was done about 40 years ago, but many of these things are still relevant to us. So top hassles include things like weight concerns, health, rising price of goods, home maintenance, too many things to do. Uplifts include a lot of social things, so relating well to others, completing tasks well, feeling healthy, getting enough sleep, things like that. Some takeaways from this are, again, that it can be really helpful to patients to help direct their focus to the silver lining. Again, my favorite way to do this, and I do this in session, if I've got a client who just kind of rolls in like a hurricane and is just like coming at me with all this negative, I'll just be like, whoa, whoa. Like, I feel like you need to tell me 3 things that you're grateful for right now before we move on. And that just kind of 3 things can completely reset a person's mindset. And again, that's a super easy intervention that you can do even in a medical setting. Another thing that can be helpful is to encourage people to take personal control of the situation. Control is to a degree a privilege based on, where we are in life, finances, education, our jobs. We have more of an ability to be flexible and take control than others. But I find that in most situations, you can take a little bit more control over what's going on, even if it's just by changing your perspective to what's going on. For instance, particularly recently, I get a lot of students who are frustrated with their classes in online education and just don't want to do this anymore. And sometimes it can be helpful to recognize that you're here for a reason. You have a career that you want. That career requires a bachelor's degree. That bachelor's degree requires this class. And so in a way, you want to be here. This is you on your path to what you want to do. And if you don't want to be here, no one's forcing you to be here. You don't have to be in this class. And frequently just kind of talking through stuff like that and shifting your perspective can make someone who felt completely out of control, completely in a class they don't want to be in, to at least feel like, okay, like this still sucks. I don't love it, but like, you're right. This is in service of something that I want to do. I am in control of this. I am choosing this. Similarly, helping patients to adopt a challenge perspective can also be a helpful coping mechanism as well. Research indicates that when people don't have enough stress in their life, they actually can become really bored and depressed. And when they have too much stress, they frequently become anxious. And people actually feel happiest, healthiest, peak in terms of their performance when they have an optimal level of stress or challenge in their life. And so it can also be helpful to help patients kind of find that sweet spot. So if you have someone who's really lethargic and bored and depressed, challenging them to kind of get out there and do a bit more can actually be helpful. And then on the anxious side of things, helping people to kind of downgrade stress to whatever degree possible can be really helpful as well. Similarly, viewing stressors as challenges can be a helpful perspective. So this isn't kind of this thing that's been thrown at me that now I'm just stuck with. Again, an online class is an example. This is a challenge to overcome. And people who view the stressors in their lives as challenges to tackle and defeat typically are healthier and happier, and have even improved immune responses compared to people who just kind of view these things in a more doom and gloom type of way. Exercise can also help. As we've mentioned before, all stressors activate the same system in the body. And one of the things that can help people prepare better for future stress is moderate controlled stress on a regular basis. And exercise is the perfect moderate controlled stressor. You choose when you do it, you choose exactly what you want to do. It's moderate, and that like we're not dealing with a trauma, but we're just kind of dealing with something in the mild to moderate range. And so exercise on a regular basis can actually help to train up, I guess, if you want to think of it that way, the stress response part of your nervous system, and can help you be more resilient to stressors in the future. Environmental stressors is going to be another category that we're potentially dealing with. These are largely inescapable and uncontrollable. Yes, you could move, but moving is a huge stressor in and of itself, and not everybody has the ability to just pick up and move. And so they can really take a toll on well-being. Examples of environmental stressors include things like the light, the noise, the pollution in big cities like New York. Long-term uncontrolled unsolicited noise has been associated with poor health, specifically a higher blood pressure rate and elevated stress hormones in the long run. However, when it comes to noise, it turns out that subjective appraisal is key to the stress response even being activated in the first place. So if you enjoy the noise, if you chose to live here, if you love it, it's probably not going to bother you, and it's probably not going to have a negative health impact. But if you're living in a crappy apartment near the subway and that's the only place you can afford to live, you don't want to be there, then yes, that unsolicited, uncontrolled noise is going to have a negative impact on one's health. And this is true even on a more minor level. People have a greater stress response when, like, their cubicle mate has a white noise machine on, or is listening to music, or just like chewing gum in a really annoying way. Like, if it's noise in your environment that you're not okay with and you didn't pick and you didn't A-okay as being there, you're going to have a stress response. Versus you yourself could be listening to the same music, have the same white noise machine on, be chewing your gum in the same annoying way, but because you chose it, you're not having that same response. So that's kind of an important piece to acknowledge, especially if you end up working in more of an urban area where we see this problem more, that it can be important to acknowledge where a person lives, but also to what degree did they control that choice or choose that for themselves. Crowding is another piece of, the environmental stressor kind of, dimension. Crowding relates to a concept called population density. Population density is a physical objective measure. It's like how many people are existing within a particular space. Crowding, though, is psychological. It's subjective. It's feeling as if one does not have enough space. And sometimes it's related to population density, but sometimes it's completely separate as well. So for instance, you could have someone, again, in Times Square who absolutely loves it, who thrives on this environment. It's extremely dense, but this person doesn't really feel super crowded because they're really enjoying where they're at, kind of similar to what we talked about earlier with the noise. Alternatively, you could have someone who just really wants some alone time and decides to go camping. And, as soon as they set up their campground and kind of walk around a little bit, they notice that, there's a family of 4 right around the bend and the kids are kind of loud. And even though the population density of that area is very low, you've got 5 people in a square mile, you could feel really crowded if you're feeling like you don't have the space that you wanted. And so it is important to recognize that while population density relates to crowding, that they are 2 different things, and that subjective psychological appraisal is really what's most important with certain stressors like noise or density. A final environmental piece that I'll point out is the environment of poverty. The environment of poverty is a combination of long-term, uncontrolled, unsolicited noise with high population density that's combined with high levels of pollution, high levels of discrimination in the form of housing policies or racial discrimination even, higher unemployment rates, high crime rates, and high rates of violence as well. And that living in this environment takes the greatest emotional and physical toll on a person. So on this slide, we focus primarily more on what I would call like physical environmental types of stressors, things that are a bit more kind of tangible within one's environment. We will kind of circle back around to refocusing on the role that racial discrimination can play in one's health, and we're going to focus on that more in our chapter about heart diseases and diabetes. So this is not kind of the extent of our discussion of environments and the role that systemic factors of our environment can play on our health. We will circle back around. And then finally, we've got work stress. And there are a couple of different facets of work stress that I want to focus on. One is the fact that work has really changed in the past couple decades, and that's changed our relationship to work and the amount of stress as a consequence. So specifically what has happened is that we've shifted from more farming, manufacturing types of work to more knowledge-based work. And with that, we have more stress because we're not just dealing with the physical stress of farming or building something, we're dealing with more the psychosocial stress of relating to our peers and relying on our own thought and critical thinking to do our jobs and earn an income as a consequence. There's a greater emphasis on higher education these days than there used to be, which, is a financial stressor that can also just be a stressor for students who maybe want a particular job, but also aren't particularly academically minded. It's just a stressor in a variety of different ways. And that is something that's different than, previously when you would just kind of leave from secondary education or may not even finish secondary education before going to work. And, work was kind of simpler, I guess, in that way and less stressful. Not to say that things are perfect, but from a stress perspective. Many jobs are outsourced, meaning that there may be greater competition for jobs because a person could theoretically be hired for a job from any place in the US or potentially even internationally. So that can increase competition. That also kind of incorporates this new skill that everyone's kind of, having to take a crash course on over the past year, which is kind of telecommunication and working remotely. And so for people who have a tough time picking up new skills, or for people who aren't particularly tech savvy to begin with, that can be a huge stressor. Related to that, ageism. Older workers now suffer more without these newer job skills. A tremendous number of the skills that workers have these days aren't even really things that are necessarily taught directly in school. They're just kind of things that we pick up on more. So things like tech skills, it's more expected that kids are really just going to pick up a lot of these skills, like with social media, for instance. Like social media is like a whole field, you know, in and of itself, and it's not really something that you're formally taught. It's something that you kind of pick up on your own. So older workers are being hit by some of these tech shifts more so than others, which of course can be stressful. Another big change is that there's also been a greater emphasis recently placed on the quality of fit between workers and their jobs. And so this kind of poses a humanistic kind of psychological stressor. So now it's no longer about just getting a good paying job to provide for yourself and maybe your family. But it's about kind of finding your bliss and your passion. So that's a lot of pressure to kind of put all of this onto one job. And so some of the things that people think about is, you know, what type of person they are and what type of job, you know, would be best for them, would help them, again, kind of find their bliss. So like social people, you know, might put more emphasis on themselves to work in a helping position, for instance. A guy named Holland is the guy who's most commonly associated with what's called person environment congruence, which, as the name suggests, is the congruence between an individual and the environment in which they work. And so he describes 6 different types of people, and that those different types of people are better suited for different jobs. And so what this does is, again, it just kind of put a lot more pressure onto people's jobs, because again, it's not just about using a job to meet one's basic needs, but now we're kind of expecting jobs to meet our basic needs, as you guys can see on Maslow's hierarchy on the screen, but we're also expecting jobs to meet our psychological needs. We're hoping for them to boost our self-esteem, and we are hoping that jobs are going to allow us to self-actualize and fulfill our full potential, which is a lot more stressful than just kind of looking for like a clerical job or something that, you know, clock in, clock out, pay the bills, and that's it. It's nice, you know, if you can find a good fit. It definitely can make work more enjoyable, but it is kind of an added stress nonetheless. Other work considerations is that even if you do find yourself in a well-matched job, there are other things to consider. One example is a social evaluative threat, meaning that a person may find themselves in a situation in which they fear negative evaluation for their appearance or their abilities. So worried that, you know, someone will think you are less suited for your job on the basis of what you look like. And this could be on the basis of sexism, racism, homophobia, or this could be on the basis of one's abilities that they're a little insecure about as well. Some of what drives this is people's pursuit of perfectionism, which in large part has really been fostered by social media and this tendency for us all to present ourselves perfectly online. And so this can make us feel extra sensitive if we feel like we're not really living up to that expectation in real life. Beyond that, there are also stereotype threats, which are kind of a sub, I guess, category of social evaluative threats that are specific to fears that we will fulfill a negative stereotype about our group. So one such example, you know, women are bad at math. So as a woman, if you are even like average in math, like you might be more worried, that your abilities in math will not live up to what you'll need to do this job, but B, like it would be one thing if I'm just bad at math, but B, you know, now I'm kind of letting womankind down because I am living up to that negative stereotype about my group. So that can be an added piece, is not just the fear of not having an ability, but a kind of a fear of letting your group down by upholding a negative stereotype. Overload is another type of work stress. Overload, as the name suggests, is just doing too much. Role overload specifically is something that impacts women more so. So women who are trying to be the parent, the primary caregiver, and also who are trying to work at the same time. That's not to say that men can't get put in that position, but statistically, women are more likely to be in that position than men. Burnout is job-related physical and psychological exhaustion. We see it more so in jobs requiring responsibility for others. So if you're a more social type of person like myself and you thrive in the helper kinds of fields, this is us. And since this is health psychology, I would imagine that, you know, a number of you guys are kind of in this boat as well. These can also be extremely fulfilling jobs. These are some jobs where some people really report the most joy, but they can also become the most taxing. Some ways to combat burnout: high self-esteem. So engaging in like gratitude exercises or exercises where you're kind of acknowledging the things that went well over the course of the day or things that you're thankful for. Doing that for like 5 minutes before bed can help to foster self-esteem and gratitude, obviously. Personal control is something that is also helpful as well. Unfortunately, personal control, as I mentioned before, is kind of a dicey issue, and that depending on what it is you're doing, you might not have a ton of control. Um, I like to, when I'm working with patients, to help them kind of work back to like, you know, you might not have control over what you're doing in this job, but you have control over whether you want to persist with this job or quit and do something else. And even though that's a difficult choice, at least it's kind of giving that person a little bit more control, like you're choosing whether or not you stay with this. Alternatively, employers have a huge amount of power here in giving their employees more control. So rather than micromanaging exactly what it is, you know, your team of like office managers or office workers do, give them more kind of broad expectations and let them kind of do their jobs the way that they want to do. So, you know, if your employee could theoretically do their work at any point over the course of the day, then maybe don't emphasize the whole 9 to 5 thing as much. Like if you have someone who wants to come in at 5 and leave at 2 or 3, let them do it. If you have someone who's more of a night owl and wants to come in at noon and work until 8 at night, let them do it. Like just let go of more of that stuff. And research has suggested that if you can give people little bits of more control, that they feel healthier, even if that's just control over like what they can decorate their desks with. And we see this in patients too. The patients respond better to surgeries and interventions if they're allowed to like decorate their room or just order from, you know, a limited menu of food at the hospital versus like today's meatloaf day, and that's just kind of the way that it is. Some other high risk types of jobs that can set people up for burnout and overload are shift work, particularly third shift. Again, that's not everyone. If you like third shift, great, that probably works for you. But if you're in kind of shift work and that's not really what you want, again, it kind of goes back to control, then that's something to kind of look out for. Role ambiguity, someone who's working in a position and they're not quite sure what it is they're supposed to be doing. The job position wasn't well outlined. They might be asked to do very different things by their boss on different days. That can be stressful. Having inadequate opportunity for advancement. So like you're hired and you know there might be one opportunity for a raise and that's it, or maybe even no opportunities for a raise. And then subordinates. All of these things can foster anger and be associated with poor health outcomes, things like heart disease. So from a provider perspective, it can just be important to like not just ask a person like, oh, what do you do for a living? And they say, you know, I am a fast food worker, and you just kind of note that and move on. It can be important to kind of ask like, how's that going? And just kind of get a little bit more information, because any job can be a helpful thing or a hurtful thing, just kind of based on how the person's approaching it. So how does stress make you sick? This is going to be the latter half of this lecture. One way in which stress can make us sick is directly. So we have the stress response, which, you know, you should recognize the slide from last time, which includes mobilizing energy, elevated blood pressure, stress hormones, the halting of the long-term projects, heightened cognitive and sensory skills. And the direct hypothesis says that these things happen. And like that's step one, and step two is the allostatic load, and we're seeing that the energy has been mobilized, and as a consequence now we're fatigued, the blood pressure is high, and as a consequence we've got high blood pressure. So the direct effect in large part is what I presented last time. Step A is the stress response, step B is the allostatic load and the sickness. An alternative hypothesis to what's going on is called the indirect effect. And we'll talk about several direct and indirect effects this semester. In a nutshell, a direct effect is step one, step two. Indirect effect is that we've got a third step in the middle. So first thing happens, another thing happens in the middle, and then we kind of get to that end result. So the indirect effect here is that we have the stress response, and that then the person is engaging in health risk behaviors to manage the stress. And it's a consequence of those health risk behaviors in combination with the stress response that's causing the sickness and the allostatic load. So we've got someone who is stressed out. As a consequence, they're drinking, they're smoking, they're not sleeping well, they're not exercising, their nutrition sucks. And so as a consequence of all of that, now they have hypertension, now they're not sleeping well, and we're not seeing good remodeling of bone and tissue. Now we're seeing reproductive disorders, et cetera, et cetera. So direct response is stress, and then immediately the allostatic load. Indirect is the stress. We've got some unhealthy health behaviors in there as coping mechanism, and that collectively is leading to the sickness. Beyond that, we have 4 other models, one of which you guys are already familiar with. So really just kind of 3 new models to introduce, and then we will be done for the day. So the general adaptation syndrome is Hans-Selye's that we talked about last time. Again, we've got that alarm phase, resistance, and then exhaustion. The one thing to kind of keep in mind here, again, is that exhaustion does not occur because reserves are depleted, as this kind of graphic suggests, but instead exhaustion happens because the stress response has become more damaging than it is helpful at this point. Another model of stress, and the first new one for today, is the cognitive appraisal model, sometimes referred to as the transactional model. And this comes to us from a guy named Lazarus. Basically, what Lazarus said is that the experience of stress depends on cognitive appraisal of potential stressors' impact. And so at the end of the day, how we respond to stress is a combination of the physical stressor itself, but then also what we think about the stressor and how we cope, and that all these pieces kind of roll into one another to ultimately, leave us with the impact of stress on the body. So what happens first is that we are in some type of environment with stressors. And we encounter our first stressor that is really kind of impacting us, because not all stressors necessarily are going to impact us. So we encounter our stressor. In this analogy, I'm going to say that the stressor is a car horn. So you're driving your car down rivers, let's say, and you hear a car horn, you hear someone beeping. So that's the stressor. You kind of jump, you're alert. And now we enter into primary appraisal. Primary appraisal is a phase during which we interpret what the stressor means. And there are 3 different ways we can kind of define a stressor. It's either a positive stressor, like if you were walking into a room and everybody jumps up and yells surprise and the lights come on, that's kind of alarming. But when you think about it, it's like, oh, this is positive. This is a surprise party. Dangerous would be that you've thought about the stressor, you've appraised it, and you've determined that this is potentially threatening. And then irrelevant is like, oh, that's not me. So if you realize that the car horn was, on the other lane of traffic, it had nothing to do with you, that would be more irrelevant. But in this scenario, let's say that the car horn was directed at you and that you're drifting out of your lane. So potentially dangerous. From then, we move to secondary appraisal, which is more of an internal analysis of available resources to help you deal with the stressor. And basically, we can determine that we have insufficient resources or sufficient resources. So am I able to cope with the stressor that I've now identified or not? So at this stage, it's basically kind of asking yourself, like, what do I do? Is there something I can do or not? You might determine there are insufficient resources if at this point, like, there's no going back, an accident's going to happen, or sufficient resources if you've determined that there's enough time to kind of get your car back in line. If there are insufficient resources, this is kind of really when we're feeling stress, that there's nothing else to do, stress response is on, and we're just kind of bracing ourselves for the worst. Sufficient resources, though, would bring us to a coping phase where we do something. And so in this scenario, we would, let's say we have sufficient resources, we realize that there is something that we can do, and so we cope. We adjust steering to recenter the car in the lane. In terms of coping, there are two different ways that we can really cope. Problem-focused coping is a type of coping, and we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, that's focused more on problem solving, changing the situation, versus emotion-focused coping is more focused on emotions, processing how you feel and your relation to the situation. So emotion-focused coping might be more appropriate in a situation where you have insufficient resources, there's nothing really left you can do. Problem-focused coping, though, would be a more appropriate route to take if you did have sufficient resources. And then finally, reappraisal is kind of checking back in. Did that coping address the situation, or do I need to kind of go through the steps again? And for some, you might find that you're going through the steps several times. For others, something like a simple driving example, you'd only have to go through once. So you adjust, you look back around, everything's good. Okay, cool. Moving on with your day. Another model of stress is the diathesis stress model. This model basically proposes that there are two factors that determine a person's susceptibility to stress and illness, and those factors are the diathesis, which are predisposing factors like a person's family history, their genetics, their personality, and stress, which are immediately precipitating factors like traumatic experiences or just kind of stressors that are posing as a stress for you. And whether or not a person is going to get sick is going to be a combination of their diathesis and stress, and kind of whether that combination pushes this person to illness or not. So I like to use, there are a couple different metaphors you can use to kind of conceptualize this model. One is the kind of race start line, finish line metaphor, and that's what's represented here on the screen. So you can think of all of us as having different diatheses based on our family history, genetics, and personality. And those diatheses, if we're thinking about this as like a race, you know, would be moving the start line of that race closer to the finish line. And the finish line in this case would be the development of some type of illness, whether that is heart disease, schizophrenia, depression, whatever. And so someone with a positive family history, genetic history, with a more neurotic personality would be starting very close to the finish line. And so that person would really only need a relatively small amount of stress to push them over that threshold, versus someone who doesn't have a family history and who has a more conscientious, healthy personality is someone who would be starting further away. And so that person could afford a relatively larger amount of stress in their life before becoming sick. Another metaphor is like the cup of water. Like if you imagine that our lives are a glass of water, and that, you know, at birth, there's a certain amount of water in that glass, and that water is going to be representative of our diathesis. A larger diathesis would be a larger amount of water, and vice versa, and that stressors are going to be additional drops or pores, and that then when the cup overflows, that would be sickness. Again, someone who has a greater diathesis can afford little stress. Someone with a lesser diathesis can afford more stress before kind of hitting that tipping point. An actual kind of real world application of this as far as PTSD goes, about 10 to 30% of veterans are diagnosed with PTSD, but many veterans go through the same types of stressors. So in this case, why are only some people developing PTSD, some who went through the exact same situations versus others aren't? You could conceptualize the explanation of that being diathesis, that some people went into that situation with a greater amount of diathesis, or even a greater number of stressors previously in that person's life, and so they're developing PTSD, whereas others don't have those same precipitating factors. Finally, we've got the tend and befriend hypothesis. This is a hypothesis that comes to us from Shelley Taylor, who's an evolutionary psychologist, and she has more of an evolutionary perspective. So this is kind of the female equivalent of the fight or flight. She acknowledges that females more than males are more likely to respond to stress with tend and befriend behaviors, which she describes as the tendency to nurture and care for offspring in order to protect them from harm, which would be tending, and establishing and maintaining social networks to facilitate the process, which would be befriending. So tend and befriend is basically her female equivalent of, again, again, the fight or flight, saying that women have a greater tendency to respond to stress in this way than to fight or flee, which would be more of a masculine type of response. And as it turns out, there is some good evolutionary as well as biological evidence to kind of back up her claim. One is that women more often foraged for food and cared for children, and that was kind of the day in, day out task. But that was also the task that would be undertaken during times of stress, like food shortage. And so tending and befriending promotes success in this particular situation, that it makes more sense for a group of women to collectively focus on foraging and caring for children, and they're going to be more successful in dealing with the stressor of famine or starvation if they kind of work together in that way than if they begin a war with each other or just kind of run and exist independently. Also, some interesting biological evidence for this theory comes to us in the form of estrogen. And that estrogen is, our female hormone, and estrogen can actually facilitate the release of oxytocin, aka the love hormone, in stressful situations. So when women are stressed, they're going through, the same cocktail of, stress hormones that men do, but their estrogen is also releasing oxytocin, which is going to facilitate bonding. Oxytocin also blunts some of those other hormones and decreases the tendency to either aggress or flee. So we've got some evolutionary support, and we also have some biological support for this kind of alternative way of responding to stressors. Okay, cool. So, so those are your models. So takeaways from this lecture should be a strong understanding of the different types of psychosocial stressors, how this information could really relate to you in the future as a provider. How would this inform how you would deal with patients, for instance? And then you should also be familiar with the different models of stress and examples of how these different models would play out.